I love a phrase from Alan Kay, which says simple things should be easy and the complex should be possible. And developer experience is just when you start pulling that thread. That's it. You need to identify, okay, what are the simple things? What's the 80-20? What are the common things that people are going to want to do with its API? Okay, how do we make that simple? How do we make that as obvious as possible?
Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of AI Without Borders. I'm thrilled to have Damian. Damian is VP of R&D at Auth0 Labs, which is part of Okta, one of the leading security and authentication companies in the world. Damian was one of Auth0 early employees, but most importantly for this podcast, he is originally from Argentina. Damian, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Hey, Daniel. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
And for people who are not as familiar, what is Auth0 Lab and what is its role inside Okta?
Auth0 Lab is a small team within Auth0. Auth0 is a product, and it was a company that was acquired by Okta. So Auth0, what it does is it allows developers, they are our customers, to simplify how users authenticate to their apps. So the example I typically use is if you're building an application and you want to do the typical signing form with either user and password, or with letting an email, or signing with Google, signing with Facebook, that takes time to implement. It's important because it has security implications and so on. The larger your app gets, the more important that becomes. So we make that easy, we make that secure. And then at Auth0 Lab, what we do is we explore and implement new products and new features that are related to what we think is the future of those kind of like capabilities, which are authentication, who the user is, authorization, what they can do, and a bunch of other things. And yeah, that's a bit about us. And we've been spending a lot of time figuring out how to help secure AI apps most recently. Everyone's focused on AI.
When did the focus and priority started around like authentication for different AI use cases?
Yeah, I think our aha moment, at least mine, and like where we started kind of like talking about it a lot with the team was GPT-4. So ChatGPT with GPT-4, that was a huge jump from 3.5. At that point, I remember when it came out, we did a team hackathon. We were at an offsite and we spent a few days and we did like 4 things. And of course, like building the sample app or the MVP with AI looks easy because it works. And of course, like you would have needed to do a lot of testing and tuning and like evals and stuff, like to make sure that it actually worked in production for edge cases. But we were like, okay, this is a huge jump. And that's when we started following this very closely, and we started seeing kind of some of the frameworks come out, and like you started seeing how people kind of like interacted with ChatGPT, and that ChatGPT needed to kind of get data from other systems. And a lot of those problems were related to authentication, right? How do you get your Google Drive files? And you started seeing frameworks like LangChain or Llama Index that were showing, hey, this is how you get your emails into an agent, right? And when you looked at how that was done, it wasn't the most secure thing in the world. That's okay, right? Again, like pioneer at the age of AI and you're moving fast. But that's where we are good. We're good at making things easy to implement for developers while keeping it secure. So we started kind of like slowly looking at, okay, what are the patterns here? And like, what are developers going to need to do? And like, what will enterprises care about from a security perspective? And that's where we started thinking about, okay, what's the first offering? Because nothing's final. That we should be putting out there for companies and teams building with AI, Gen AI.
And as you think about identity and security as it relates to agents, what are some of the new risks from that standpoint that emerge as a result of kind of this new paradigm? And what are some of the things that you think remain fairly similar to the risk and challenges we had around Auth historically?
A lot of what's happening is more, not necessarily new, it's just the frequency with which it can happen in AI apps has changed compared to like apps and mobile apps. We're starting to see this when you get into MCP, and I'm going to add a lot of MCP servers to give my agent context, right? So like most web and mobile apps, don't connect to a lot of your other apps. And that connection, when you think about it, now has increased kind of like surface area for security issues and leaks. So that has been a big change. How do you secure those? How do you make sure that one app or one agent can only access the things that it should and minimize like the exposure area? Another one is kind of the non-determinism of agents, right? Or an AI in general, where you get into, okay, for the same prompt, it can change its output depending on the temperature or depending on the minor version of the same model, or if you're using different models for the same prompt. Ways in which the behavior changes. And that doesn't typically happen in web apps, mobile apps, and APIs, right? You have schemas, and again, you have to do validation, but you don't just accept anything. Whereas with AI, we've started to see that both between kind of bad implementations, but also just the flow of things, like the surface area becomes smaller. So when you start kind of like combining these things, you end up with, okay, you have to protect from the LM giving you the wrong inputs, and like you should never trust that like what you get from the LLM is right. So like minimize how you feed credentials to it, minimize the data that you feed to it, because like if you feed it data that the user shouldn't be seeing, the user is going to see it. Basically, all of these are sound security principles in general. I would say it's now more likely that bad things happen, not that they are new things.
Some of the new AI native players in the auth space, I've seen argued kind of like traditional auth companies may struggle to adapt with this new agent authentication, as their architectures are built around human users singing into applications versus AI. What's your take on it?
Yeah. So the first thing is, as Charlie Munger used to say, don't ask the barber if you need a haircut, right? Like each company is going to have their own speech, and they're going to say what they need. They're trying to survive. They're trying to get customers. That's normal. You see that at all levels. So when we get into concrete things, do some protocols need to be updated and change a bit so that we can kind of like better support agentic use cases? Yeah, but that's not life, right? Like you get new requirements and you have to iterate. Can the current protocols do it? Yeah, as well. Yeah, it will take changes. Maybe we need to standardize things faster, but also you don't want to standardize things before they become common practice, because you might be standardizing the wrong thing. But again, when you get into an agent access an account or like an API on my behalf, like that's auth, right? Like an agent in that case is kind of like wearing a client hat, and like it's accessing content on your behalf. So then you get into, okay, can the agent, like, oh, I just want the agent to read like some of my emails, but not all of my emails. Well, that has always been the case. Like if you were giving any app access to your emails and they were using Gmail, you had to do read emails. There was not like read one email, read some emails. So what happens now is like this becomes more obvious because many of your apps will want to read your emails, your Google Drive. So like this fine-grained access does become more important. But again, this is not new. We can address it. Like it's all supported, right? Then you can get into, okay, like what if my agent has its own permissions? We can also support that. Like Skim can support users, it can support agents. And then you get into, okay, in that case, an agent is more like a subject. So agents can wear hats, and that's okay. Clients in Auth can also be subjects when you have like credentials. So as you start kind of like going down these cases, you might be like, oh yeah, we need maybe a new like extension to a protocol, or we need to change kind of like one of the specs to add support for this. But I think it's doable. We are doing it, and so far it's been working well with, again, both startups and large enterprises that are interested in what we're doing. And at the same time, again, none of this is new. I think that's the key, right? It's just like frequencies changed.
One of the interesting challenges that emerge as well is that several of these agents don't necessarily have a UI exposed to a user, but there's still a need to authenticate, as you say, because the risks actually are increasing. Can you share how Auth0 helps with that?
So this is a very good example of how this is not new, right? Like we've had daemons, background processes, whatever, for ages. And in general, again, like barring some exceptions, what most enterprises have done is just hard code an API key or a pair of client credentials somewhere. Like you might get them from a vault, and the daemon starts and like it authenticates and it gets its credentials, and that's it. So it can call whatever API it needs to. Like that's an agent that doesn't have a UI. Yeah, you might not be running kind of like any LLM code inside of it, but like it's like from a like security perspective, if you squint, it's the same. So what is happening again is the frequency, right? Like what AI does, what LLMs do is they allow anyone to create their own daemons with their own personal instance for them, because you can just like programmatically do it. So yes, the frequency of these increases. And then at that point, if you're not a programmer, should you be kind of finding a key for kind of one of your enterprise apps, getting an API key, pasting? You don't want that. The key might be over provisions. You need to figure out, okay, how do I give it access? And then you get into, well, some of these agents are also going to be doing things kind of like for longer periods of time. So like even if they have a UI, I might not be in front of my like web app or whatever. So like that's where like you need a way to authenticate users out of band. So then we get into, okay, how do I get an application or an agent that doesn't have a user interface, credentials on demand when it needs to? But, and this is the key, like I should be able to kind of, again, if I'm in an enterprise scenario, this should go through the identity provider. If I'm a user, it should go through consent and so on. And there is a protocol for that. Like there's a protocol that is called, right, CIVA, or client-initiated back-channel authentication or authorization. I forget which one it is. It's heavily used in financial grade applications, right? Where you get a push notification confirming that you want to do one wire transfer. You get that push out of band. It's not on the web app, right? Where you're typically doing the wire transfer, you get it on your phone. But the web app doesn't need to be open. And that's the trick. So if the agent doesn't have a UI, you can get a push. We're implementing support for things like email. The key thing there is like you can combine this with like your ability to get tokens for APIs. So the user authenticates, creates a session, then it can go kind of like integrate with your APIs and if like third-party APIs, which is another feature which we call token vault. And then when you start thinking about, okay, what's the progress of AI going to be, right? So what we're seeing is we started with, again, the first relatively massive Gen AI app, ChatGPT, and now we're starting to see agents, in particular coding agents, and they're running tasks for longer, right? You see Replit, like the 3-hour claim and so on. So if you start to extrapolate, those agents are going to run longer. That's great. They are going to be more autonomous, but they should request confirmation and access things on demand. So that's where like human in the loop comes in. That's where, but like if I sign in today, and the agent needs help in 5 days, my session might not exist. So like this authentication isn't just a human in the loop where you get a message, you might actually need to establish a session. And that's what our kind of capability, which we call async authorization, does. It uses CIVA, a protocol that has been around. We did not invent this, and we make it available through push notification, through email. We're talking with customers or like adding other channels that they might need, like should we use we use that and so on.
And do you have any advice for founders and builders that relate to that point that you mentioned? So a bit of the original promise of agents is you give it a goal and it has more flexibility than in traditional workflows, both in the time that it might take, the amount of tools that it may call in that process to reach to that goal. At the same time, I'm seeing today that more of the agent workflows are more narrowly scoped, more short term. As builders think about this open short-ended, which has pros and cons on both sides, from an Auth standpoint, do you have any framework or things builders should be asking themselves?
I don't think like if I try to wear kind of like I'm advising people on how to build agents, I'm the right person for this. I haven't built that many agents in prod. I played around with stuff. But our focus has been how do we enable others to build their agents and more from like an auth security perspective. And in that case, it's always the same, right? It's like minimize access, right? Like you don't want, let's say you want an agent that you build that's an internal agent to access people's Google Drives so that it can create reports and stuff. Like if you create a master or like admin-like API key and you hand it over to the agent, at that point, again, if that gets leaked, you have a problem. It's very easy for that key to be used by like the agent accidentally and leak data that a user shouldn't have access to, right? So like if I have access to a Google Drive doc and you don't, but the API key is an admin key, you might see it. But again, this is not new, right? The difference is before, like what happened was the access to either the API or the underlying data, for example, for an internal app, was gated by who had access to the UI, right? So like you went to your IDP and you said, oh, I have this app, only some people can use it. And then like you could use the backend, you can use the data. And the way I'm explaining it is AI unbundles or separates or changes your typical 3-layer architecture where you have like the UI, the presentation layer, like the UI, the business layer, let's call it the API, and you had database. Let's say you have one chatbot to simplify. The chatbot just became the UI, but it's now connected to all APIs. Because everyone has access to a chatbot, you can no longer rely on the UI being kind of like how you get access. So you need authorization or authentication on the API. You need authorization or authentication on your database. Like when you're doing RAG and you're reading directly from the DB, you need to consider user permissions. That's the biggest change. Again, as I said before, none of this is new. You just have it becomes a lot more important. And this is what we see. We're seeing a lot of companies that are building internal with AI, like again, internal agents, internal use cases, internal MCP servers. And if you don't think about these things, what's going to happen is like some employees are going to see things that they shouldn't. And some employees are going to be able to even intentionally or accidentally write data or like delete records that they shouldn't. And
And there you mentioned MCP, which kind of the big trend this year, 2025, has been MCP. As you were saying, Auth0 offers Auth for MCP servers. What are some of the things that, as it relates to MCP, still not solved and could be built from an Auth security standpoint that could help developers?
Yeah, there's a lot. I was joking yesterday on X that every week you see a company either building a product or a startup launching that's like building an MCP gateway or something of the sort. Like there's a few things, right? Like, so you get into first, who can access the MCP server, and then what can they do, right? So like that's obvious, but like not a lot of folks talked about it. When MCP first came out, it wasn't even supported. Like there was no support for Auth. So we and many others in the community worked with the MCP team to implement that, and we've iterated a lot on that. And then you get into, okay, how does the MCP server get credentials to call APIs, right, on your behalf or on its behalf, depending on the use case? And like that gets into like, what should you do, right? Like you don't want to hard code an API key because then you get into like this overly permission scenario. So that's when you can do things from a developer experience perspective, like exchanging tokens and getting into, okay, this MCP server can access these apps if they were pre-authenticated and so on. And then there are companies that are doing things around finer grained access policies. So like even if the upstream API doesn't support something, they use the MCP as a proxy. We're seeing MCP gateways being implemented where you just have one gateway that like implements access to a lot of MCP servers internally, and you get auditing and policy and all of that in the gateway. So there's a bunch of stuff. We started with, again, first we started working very closely with the MCP team on defining Auth, and like folks from our team like Aaron Parecki and like Abhishek have done amazing work kind of like helping define it in the spec. And then we've worked on the product to make it easy to implement Auth for an MCP server. If you're already using Auth0, again, an MCP server becomes an API. We had support for like calling those and defining scopes in Auth0 for ages. MCP clients can become clients. First, there was a whole thing around like what's called dynamic client registration, which is a way of like saying, okay, I don't know who the client is, but like I will allow it to go and authenticate. That change in the spec. Now we're adding support for like that spec change with like what's known as client metadata. And so like, again, as the spec changes, we'll add support for those. And then what we'll do is we'll probably integrate or create tooling so that it's easy to kind of like call other APIs. But we have other ideas beyond that, but like it's hard to kind of like say, okay, we will definitely do all of these or not. So like some of those things we're still exploring.
And before, when we were speaking about MCP, you were speaking about the roadmap. As you lead Auth0 Labs roadmap, how do you balance between focus on the needs that you hear from the customers will have today to also anticipating future needs that will arise and getting ahead of some of the trends, and that balance between short-term and future experiments and product roadmap?
So a couple of small clarifications. So in lab, we don't actually have a roadmap. For example, we have folks that are leading kind of like product and engineering and design and like working on the initiatives, and we kind of like are helping those teams get this into production. But that's when we say, okay, this has come from an experiment, which is what we do in the lab, to okay, let's put this in the backlog, right? The roadmap, or like, again, depending on like what level and stuff. The way we think about experiments is we think about the impact, we think about the time horizon, we think about our confidence, and that's where we start from, right? So what happened with this recent batch of like AI experiments is that we were extremely confident from what we were seeing, from what we'd seen in the industry in the past. Again, we in the team we'd been working at Auth0 and we've been working on developer products forever. A lot of the folks on the team are like founding engineers. I've been working on the products since I was like 18, starting with like consulting for like some Microsoft patterns and practices libraries. We have a good idea of what devs need, and we have a good idea of what our customers need. With AI, it was so obvious that these were going to be pain points, and we knew that, for example, okay, token vault and integrating with APIs was going to be first, and then maybe like doing authorization for RAG was right up there, but it would require some changes to people like thinking about authorization differently, because that's something that the industry is starting to catch up to. And then we were thinking, okay, like the async authorizations, how do I authenticate agents without a UI, is going to come after that. But we can already start educating people about it. And that played out exactly as we thought it would. So that gave us confidence to actually like very kind of like fast track all of these AI efforts and kind of like get them in the roadmap. But for other things, we have some experiments which I can't discuss. We're like, okay, we think this is going to happen, but we don't know when, or we don't know exactly how it should. And like those take a while, and we think about it, and we talk with customers and prospects, and we implement kind of like proof of concepts and explore different ways of doing it. And we try to figure out, okay, is this something real? Is this something big? Is this something that we should kind of like, we have the right to win at? And kind of as we start kind of figuring out all of those, if the answers are yes, then we kind of start making a case for, okay, this should be funded, this should be in the roadmap, this is something that customers want, and so on.
Topic. And as it relates to devs, and you've been around the space for quite some time, what are some of the things that you learn, and this goes beyond AI in general, that create superior developer experience, kind of lessons learned, and even small things that matter in creating that magical developer experience?
I think, so it will sound simple, but I don't think it is. But I love a phrase from Alan Kay, which says something like this: simple things should be easy and the complex should be possible. And developer experience is just when you start pulling that thread. That's it, right? Like you need to identify, okay, what are the simple things? What's the 80-20? What are the common things that people are going to want to do with its API, with its SDK, with this product? Okay, how do we make that simple? How do we make that as obvious as possible? And then you start kind of, okay, what does the API need to look for that? Both an SDK API or like an HTTP or web API. What does the documentation need to look like from that perspective? Now that we have kind of AI assisted coding, okay, what context should we provide to these models? Like, do we need an MCP, or how do you copy the docs over so that like the LLM understands the context of the app and so on? And then if you have a UI to configure kind of like these features, typically known as like a management dashboard, okay, like how do I expose the minimal set of things or that set of use cases? And then you always have the knobs, right? And the customization for the complex things, which should be possible. And like when you decide to expose those things, like that's it. So again, the details, of course, and the important thing is like figuring out, okay, for each product and for each feature and for each capability and for each customer segment, what are those things? Because they're not always the same, but it's just pulling that thread. Simple things, easy, complex things, possible.
The simplicity matters a lot. And going a bit outside the scope of Auth, but you were tweeting recently, you had an interesting tweet where you said 26 will be the year of memory. And I was curious if you can expand on that. One, why you believe 26 is going to be that year. And two, if you have any expectations, predictions, or insights on how you think that memory space will evolve specifically next year.
2025 is the year of agents by Sam Altman, and then Karpathy was like, okay, this is the decade of agents. I do think it's going to be more like a decade. And that's when, if you kind of like assume that, okay, in this decade, a lot of the primitives to develop agents that you're kind of like comfortable with are going to start kind of like being formed. And again, there are lots of startups doing this, or like enterprises doing this, but memory is one of those, right? And I think it has changed when you start using ChatGPT recently, and I don't know if that's like they ran out of GPUs or whatever because it seems slower. But like there was this version where like you had memories and it was fast and it knew about you and it would reply, and it just like that felt okay. I will keep using this, and we were just like WhatsApping with some friends, and we're like, oh no, it's slower, and it's like maybe this other model, like maybe Gemini is getting better. But like let's assume that there is this company that again knows about you, has your memories, has like again can run intelligence at scale at a cheap price. Like you will not change, right? Like getting your memories ported over will be hard. So that company will probably defend their moat by not allowing you to extract those memories. Maybe if they create a platform, right? People say, okay, OpenAI is going to have a device. So at that point, you're okay, will they allow apps in their device to access memories? And I've seen 5 startups that I kind of, at least that I keep track of, that are working in the memory space. I honestly don't know which one's better. I still have, like, I read a few papers. I need to read more papers about this. But I don't think memory is going to be portable, especially like if you think about like enterprise memory, like one enterprise does not want you to kind of like leak what you've done and so on. I think we're going to start seeing kind of like some traction here, right? Like both consumer products trying to kind of like distinguish themselves, not just by being the smartest, but also like knowing the most about you so that you have higher switching costs. And I think we're going to start seeing that products try to get into the enterprise. And again, some of those funding rounds are fairly large. And as these enterprises start building agents, and they'll start running into, okay, how do we make this better? And I think memory is going to start kind of like taking off next year. So that's what I think. Doesn't mean it's going to happen like that, but that's kind of like where that tweet came from. Or post.
And to close by, I would love to do a quick fire round. So it's 3 quick questions and you give me your quick reactions. The first one, what would you say is your most contrarian take as it relates to the generative AI space? And an alternative way of framing is there something that you read on Twitter around the AI space that you constantly think, I totally think that's wrong?
So I think this was something that I read yesterday, and it's different than the typical take. I don't think there's an AI bubble. I think we might have an LLM bubble. So I think we're going to be able, even if things didn't progress from where we are today. So let's say you could get infinite capacity of the current models, like that, that would be a way to phrase it. We would unlock a lot of productivity over the next decade just by taking the time and implementing a lot of things that we haven't had time to do, even when like AI makes you super productive, right? It will take some time. Now, when you get into like, is this a bubble or not? So I think we are going ahead, but at the same time, not from the potential is not going to be there. It's just if you think about typical things like cash flows or revenues over time. So like, yeah, some things are overly hyped, but I don't think AI is hyped when you think about like the big companies, right? Like you think about like the Microsofts and the Googles and the Nvidias. When you get into kind of other companies that are, I don't know, 250x revenues and like negative cash flows, you're like, maybe, this is. So I'm not sure how contrarian that is, but at least, yeah, I buy into the long-term hype. I don't buy into the short-term hype, so to speak.
And that's a good segue to the next one, which is what's one public company outside Okta that you are a buyer or bullish as it relates to the impact that Gen AI will have on that company?
So first of all, not investment advice. Second of all is I don't know if it will go up from here. So what I can tell you is what I hold. So when I started seeing kind of the trends in AI, one of the things that I bought, and I'm happy with that buy, was Cloudflare. But like, again, I was like, yeah, these folks are executing well. Private companies that I'm seeing kind of like execute well in the space. And again, I'm very familiar with like the devs tool space. It's like Excel, right? Like they're doing amazing work. The developer experience, simplicity of use, like a lot of the capabilities they're bringing around AI.
And last one, you already shared one, but if you have another, is there any other trend that excites you about generative AI that ideally one that's not as greatly covered today?
There are 2. One is verifiable proof of content. There was some work done. They basically were trying to figure out, okay, like, is this picture, is this video real? Was it AI generated or not? And like anything there, I think is going to be huge. I think there was some chat about that, like maybe a year and a half ago, and it has kind of like dwindled down, which is kind of dangerous when you consider how far models have come. And the other one's memory. We're going to have, much like we've had kind of, let's say, a lot of large companies try to get your data around preferences for ads and stuff. I think memory is going to be that battleground for the next 10 years.
And with that exciting note, Damian, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, I'm here. Great to be here, and thank you for having me.